Hey, everybody, and welcome to From Suds to Spirits. My name is Aaron Gore. I am the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for the Fifth Ingredient. And today we're talking about a subject that has been more and more relevant to the beer industry as the years have gone on. And that's really that the average brewer has realized that when you have a brew house, that's actually a pretty versatile piece of equipment. Matter of fact, there's a lot that you can make with a brew house other than just beer, but whether that is cider or seltzer or cannabis beverages or spirits, the question really turns from can you into should you? And if you're going to do it, what are some of the considerations? What are some of the things that are different from beer to make sure that you are treating it with the same level of respect, the same level of care, and the same level of consideration that you are your beer portfolio? And with that in mind, very, very happy to have two incredible panelists here with me today. And gentlemen, I don't want to go ahead and introduce you. I think it's really important for you to be able to tell everybody about yourselves and about your background. But Kyle, how about you let everybody know where you're from and some of your own background and why distilling is something that's top of mind for you today?
Yeah, absolutely. Kyle Wortz, I'm the head distiller at Trillium Distilling Company and part of Trillium Brewing Company. I've been distilling for about 10 years. I'm a second generation distiller. I absolutely love it. It is, perfect blend of biology, chemistry, physics, engineering. And then at the end of the day, it keeps me up and moving around. I think it's a great job.
Well, I'm glad for that, and since this is going to be public, I'm sure sure the people you work for are glad to hear that as well. Brandon, how about you? Tell everyone where you're from and a little about what you do as it pertains to the distilling world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey everyone, my name's Brandon. I'm the director of product at 5 by 5. You might know us as the maker of programs like Distill by 5, Whiskey Systems. I've been with the company for just over 8 years now, and I've worn many hats in the business. I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of, small distilleries, kind of grow over the years. I've seen breweries, step their toe into distilling, vice versa, all of the good stuff. I'm an avid home brewer as well. So I love the nerdy science behind fermentation and what you can kind of do from that.
Well, and I think you really touched on something that's pretty key there, Brandon, that fermentation really is the foundation of any sort of distilling. It's one of the reasons why moving from brewing into distilling is something that feels very natural for a lot of breweries. But Kyle, you obviously work at a brewery that is very well known for its beer, one of the more famous breweries, at least in New England, if not in the entire country. Can you speak a little to why Trillium decided to move into the spirit space in the first place?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a main driver of wanting to kind of start this new whiskey house within New England. Um, and when you look at a brewery, as you kind of already touched on, the equipment is extremely versatile. And with a few cuts in stainless and redirects, you can do on grain fermentation, or you can continue with your lauter tun and boil kettle such. So with a little bit of input, you can dramatically kind of expand what your product line looks like. And so, it's a natural kind of growth opportunity, new market to tap into. Beer drinkers are, they cross in the spirits too, and spirits drinkers cross in the beer, but there's plenty on both sides that don't really make that transition. So, it's a whole new customer base you can go after, and a new way to really kind of express yourself through products, especially through fermentation and just really laying into the science behind it.
Well, and I do think that's one of the big transitions that the beer industry writ large has seen. It was Bart Watson, the Brewers Association, coined the term omnibibulous. The average customer drinks across categories now. You don't have the kind of category loyalists that you had even a few years ago, and that's really led to different business models. Do you see at Trillium in particular, and Brendan, if you have any clients that you think can really inform this as well, that see a significant crossover in their customer base, or are those still largely separate people that you're talking to with your products?
Yeah, I mean, speaking from experience with our customers and like also as a consumer, again, like I like the stuff too. It's Usually when you're talking about a brew distillery, if it's marketed as such and it's like, we do both things, I have seen a lot of just crossover with consumers in terms of, yeah, I like your beer and also, I'll get this as well. There's another large brewery and distillery in the New England area. And it's, you add all the cans to the cart and like, oh, you've got this spirit too, add to the cart. Just keep on adding to the cart. And it's a great way to experience, the sort of creativity that these companies like to get involved in, right? It's an outlet of for creativity and making these cool things. So like why wouldn't you go explore their other offerings?
Well, I think that's a really notable thing to really call out as well. At the end of the day, we often lose sight, especially those of us who've been in the beer industry so long, that there aren't really beer drinkers as such. You tend to have IPA drinkers, hazy IPA drinkers, stout drinkers. There's a lot more segmentation with even just the beer space than beer as a category. So a lot of what drives people to seek out these different beers from a Trillium, from a Treehouse, from a Dogfish Head is trust in the creativity, trust in the process, trust in the people that are behind these brands. So there's something to be said for marketing under the same brand as your beer. But Kyle, have you had any experience with some of the challenges that may also come with trying to market underneath the same brand as a beer, or has that been a net positive overall for you?
Uh, I think overall it's definitely been a net positive. Kind of Brandon hit on this is, people come in for beer and then they see we have spirits and they'll be like, oh, you know what, I could use another bottle of vodka at home. And so the product line attracts different people for different reasons. But I think it gives people, the confidence to say, okay, I know, I really trust the beer they're producing. I like the flavors that they choose. Their consistency is great. We'll give spirits a shot. And you have that kind of that natural segue that comes in. So overall, it's been really beneficial.
Excellent. And branding's obviously a consideration, but let's move beyond just the presentation of the product. That's something that we'll definitely get back to. That's something that follows them, and it follows some of the
Right.
base considerations for even getting into distilling in the first place. And I know for a lot of people on the brewing side, when they think of distilling, the first thing that pops into mind is, well, I need to still. And that makes sense because that's kind of the key core element of a distillery. But uh, Kyle, can you speak a little bit to some of the equipment and Brandon to some of the software or just metrics, things that people need to consider when getting into the distilling process for the first time, and how those may differ from purely running a beer brewery?
Sure. On the equipment side, as I said, everyone's kind of enamored with the still itself. People come on tours, that's what they want to see, and then I start talking, and I'm like, yeah, the still it's exciting. It looks really nice. I get it, but it is like very common for us, and it's just another piece of processing equipment. Where the magic happens is on that fermentation side. So, um, conical fermenters can be challenging, but they are doable. If we were doing on grain fermentation, you're looking at dish bottom tanks with vertical or horizontal agitators installed. But you can use conical tanks and recirc through the racking arm. So there are definitely some significant differences, but there's generally a workaround, and a solution that's available. I think some of the bigger ones are going to be kind of move into that, the explosion proofing equipment for high proof spirits, so motors, pumps, things like that.
Can you actually
Um,
speak a little to explosion proofing? Because I know for a lot of folks who have not worked in a distillery, the idea of needing to explosion proof parts of the brewery that's not just the mill room, that
yeah,
seems crazy, but this is a much higher risk factor environment if we're just talking about the upper bounds, even if the likelihood is small. So can you speak a little to what that looks like?
yeah, absolutely. So anywhere that holds spirit, if it's a fixed tank, or it's a transfer tank that we can move, we have to have the ability to bond and ground that equipment. And so that goes through everything. So we have an a PLC that we run our stills off of. That's bonded and grounded, obviously. But the stills themselves, they have to be grounded. Every piece of equipment that's in that room, if it can conduct electricity and hold a charge, it becomes a hazard. So we have grounding cables and grounding bars throughout the building, and so people will walk in and be like, oh, "What are all these bungee cables for?" And they're it's really just to ground. But yeah, static electricity becomes an issue, especially if you're dealing with closed tanks. The pressure builds up inside, the volatility increases of ethanol. So it is a real risk. And then, I mean, you can even get into barrel warehouses. And you have the angel shares, so you have ethanol evaporating out of the barrel, and that can be without airflow, potentially hazardous situation as well. So there's definitely a lot of kind of concern and insight to it. You definitely want to get an insurance company's kind of input as well when you start looking at fire risers and just the building utility systems itself. So.
And that is a major consideration right up front. It's hard enough to find insurance that'll cover your brewery. If you're looking to find insurance that'll cover your distillery, that's an absolute nightmare. So before you go into anything involving any sort of alternative beverages, but particularly something with pretty significant liability concerns like spirits, make sure that you talk to your insurance company and make sure that they'll facilitate that in the first place. If you do ever need recommendations, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I've definitely got a few who I know can help facilitate that. I'm sure Kyle and I'm sure probably even Brandon and his team do as well. But Brandon, can you speak to some of the metrics, some of the information, some of the data that people need to be tracking with respect to their spirits that might not be reflective of all fermented beverages, but are very specific to the distilled space?
Yeah, absolutely. And that starts to, that's one of the key differences between brewing and distilling. The really just the TTB's involvement, right? Obviously, TTB governs wine, beer, and spirits. But if anyone has had any experience with them, you would know that the TTB is a little bit harder when it comes to distilled spirits than wine and beer. And I mean that in terms of the level of daily reports and records that are required. I mean, there's a whole section in 27 CFR that notes like here are all of the things that you need to keep on a daily basis, right? So like speaking from a software perspective, we've created solutions so that as long as you are, more or less going about your day and logging the typical data, if you're doing distillation, it's like, what has gone into the still? What are your cuts that are coming out? What's the wine volume? What's the proof? And those sorts of things. Then, we are effectively automatically keeping all of those records for you. Like we are your electronic system of record for a lot of that stuff. So it's, if you were to go at it with workbooks or God forbid, like pen and paper, it would be a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. It's an industry where it's like not really possible to manage without some sort of program like software. Um, and that's just like the basic stuff, right? So with distilling, the moment that your alcohol is coming out of the still, that spirit's now in existence. And every drop of alcohol from that point forward needs to be accounted for in some way. And that's, that goes on all the monthly operations reports. And, that's really where software comes into play there. And that's not even touching on any of the other custom metrics that you might want to track. I mean, looking at brewing, you're, taking all of these readings daily, checking that fermentation, where's my gravity, where's my pH? The same things apply. Our software, it's tracking everything from mash all the way to bottle, everything in between. When you're getting to distillation, it's, we force you to, track the basics so that you can at least meet reporting requirements. But there's a ton more that you can add if you want to. When we're talking with folks that are, coming on board, it's like, all right, think about those weekly or monthly meetings that you guys have. Like, what are the KPIs that you want to pay attention to? What are the things that are important for understanding, efficiency how your team's doing, what's coming out, like how are you running your business? And then we kind of work backward from there. And it's like, cool, let's see where we can work those things into the program.
Absolutely. And on the topic of metrics, I mean, Kyle, what is a proof gallon? And why can't I just use barrels? So can you speak a little to some of the kind of the practical day-to-day metrics that you think are critical to be tracking? Because obviously temp, pH, those are things that brewers are well aware of. Gravity readings, but when you have a spirit, obviously, the process of making it, of actually distilling versus the process of monitoring that product through the aging process, whether it's in barrels or some other sort of format, uh, that's a very, very different process. And you're also talking about a very different life cycle since beer is a very coatable product. There's a lifespan on it, and eventually it will coat out. Versus spirits that cease to age when they're actually in the bottle, versus aging in some sort of oxygen permeable vessel. So, speak a little to some of those key considerations on the distilling side.
Yeah, I think honestly, one of the biggest ones starts just in the brew house itself. Some metrics that I'm really interested in when I look at our campaigns and distillations and wash production. We look at a proof gallon per bushel for in terms of yield. So a proof gallon is a standardized unit of measurement, 1 gallon at 100 proof. So 2 gallons at uh, 50 proof is still 1 proof gallon versus a half gallon at 200 proof. So it kind of eliminates that discrepancy that you see in volume versus what your proof is. It's just a standard unit for alcohol. I know our friends in Canada and in Europe will use liters of absolute alcohol. Same thing. It's just a different standard. Um, but yeah, we really look at kind of our efficiency starting in fermentation or at the end of fermentation in a alcohol, looking at proof gallons per bushel, and then from there we go into distilling, where with distilling you have a natural loss within your product. You cannot recover all that alcohol, no matter what you do. You can refine it as much as you want, at least I'd say under atmospheric conditions, like what the craft distilling industry is going to see, and even the larger conglomerates down in Kentucky and Tennessee. So after distillation, you also look at PGs per bushel yield, and that's a metric that not just I'm concerned with on a specific day-to-day distillation basis, but campaigns year over year. Looking back at 2021, we had difficult malt harvest across North America. We saw our American single malt previous company before I joined Trillium. We saw our PG per bushel yield go down, not just in fermentation but in distillation as well. And that's kind of the trade-off, is you have to balance what your yield looks like against quality, on what you want your product to taste like and grow into through years of maturation. If you're making a whiskey or even an aged rum. On the maturation side of things, that's a whole science in and of itself. You can get into like flavor mapping or warehouse. Predominantly, this is just temperature and humidity readings at different areas, different heights, because obviously, you get stratification in temperature. And then you couple that with GC and HPLC analysis, for specific compounds, flavor and aroma compounds. And you can paint this unbelievably complicated but very clear picture for a distiller or a blender. But it can be a lot of data up front, and it can absolutely be overwhelming. But having the ability to make custom metrics is I would say critically important, just for product consistency year over year, especially when you look at a bourbon that is a 4-year maturation time. The decisions you make today are going to affect that bottled product 4 years down the line.
Well, and it is interesting to walk into places that are dedicated to distilling, especially some of the larger warehouses, and watch brewers who have not used those spaces really understand that that barrel up there and that barrel down there have very, very different considerations as far as heat and
Yeah.
humidity. And the number of brewers I've seen the first time they see whiskey fungus and think that something has gone terribly awry never ceases to amaze me. But One thing you did mention, Kyle, is something like bourbon with a long maturation period is obviously a very, very different product than a clear liquor. Some sort of clear spirit like vodka or a gin or a white rum. What's the balance between something like that that has a quick turnaround time versus an aged spirit where you're parking that cash for significant amounts of time, particularly compared even to a barrel aged beer, which likely only spends maybe 6 months in wood?
Yeah, it's I know a lot of whiskey distillers. We pour our heart and souls into it, and at the end of the day, the kind of theme is the same: is that clear spirits pay the bills
Mhm.
while you make whiskey. Um, so you can make the best whiskey in the world, but if you're not in business when it comes of age, that barrel is going to get sold off, and it'll be someone else's pride and joy. But to do one, you generally have to do the other, especially if you're kind of moving into the distilled spirits industry. And it helps too. Not everyone out there is a bourbon drinker. Some people just want vodka. Some people want gin, and you can offer a pretty diverse range of products, especially for cocktail, whether at home or with some of your restaurants that you partner with and retailers you're selling to. There's definitely a lot of opportunity there, but yeah, you really have to make clear spirits so that you can pay for the overhead of producing your aged products.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And, you're 100% right about the versatility of spirits. That's one thing we tend to lump, just like with beer, this all under a single category. But the people who are drinking agave spirits versus the people who are drinking vodka versus the people who are drinking rye whiskey, those are very different categories. And one of the most emergent ones over the last few years has obviously been RTDs, so pre-mixed cocktails in a can. Those seem like hard seltzer the long way. Can you speak a little, Brandon, to some of the things that go into being able to actually blend those products together and track some of the costs that might be going into a single serving product as opposed to large format?
Yeah, it's all about inventory and making sure you've got your costs together. Having software is going to let you track your COGS from, if you're doing everything from grain or you're sourcing that spirit, you can track that cost all the way up into the point where you're getting ready to can that. And then it's like, all right, that's the base spirit, sure. But having software is also going to let you track the sugars, the flavorings, the any other intermediate products that you're adding to that, bitters and such. CO2 if you want to put a cost of that, sure, I guess. But and then all the packaging supplies, right? It's at that point you're thinking of it more as like a manufacturing process. Like I've got all these widgets and I'm making a widget from these, and they're all these costs that go with it. And it's definitely been a change in what we've seen. Like, again, I've been with the company for 8 years, and when I started, it was a lot of just, smaller craft shops that are just, you're doing the clear spirits and the aged spirits and that sort of thing. And it's, RTDs are huge right now. And it's, one of the things that we'll probably have to change over the next, 6 to 12 months is the fact that everything's called a bottle in our system in Distill by Five. So we'll probably have to, I suppose. But yeah, it's been a great way to, kind of as Kyle was alluding to, it's like, at the end of the day, you can be as creative as you want and make the best products in the world. But if you're not running a sound business, it doesn't really matter. And in order to have your, aged creation see the light of day and kind of be proud of that, you do have to make sure that you are paying the bills with the clear spirits, with the RTDs that are incredibly popular, bringing it back to the whole context of this conversation and even using Trillium as an example. Um, it's pretty great as a consumer being able to go to, a tasting room or a restaurant kind of a space and have so many options available to you that are all created by this same place. We as consumers, like I've always been more of a beer guy, but I have friends who hate beer. They only want RTDs, they only want cocktails or even NA. Let's throw that in there.
Mhm.
But being able to have that variety of things is increasingly important to just getting people in your doors, getting your brand out there, and making sure that you can support yourselves as a business.
Well, and it's easy to forget that a decent chunk of non-alcoholic production is a distillation process in which pure ethanol is the distillate remaining, and that really is the byproduct. So in a lot of these cases, that opens up some avenues for you. There's obviously other technical considerations. We're likely to do a future webinar on non-alcoholic production and marketing, but it's something that you have to keep in mind. But Kyle, one of the things that you mentioned stuck with me a bit, and that was the idea that if you go out of business in the interim, to Brandon's point, your barrel might wind up being somebody else's baby. Now, that's something that's absolutely mind blowing to people in the beer industry. This idea of bought in spirit, of being able to acquire liquid that's been produced by someone else and then either blended, aged, or even just rebranded under your own label. So, can you speak to that heresy and explain this unorthodoxy to the world of beer, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a general concept, we're kind of getting into what I would, generally people refer to as blending. And so in the US, blending seems to have a bad kind of connotation to it. It is changing, but everyone from your big kind of main brands that you see in every liquor store, in every bar, they blend. They're just blending their own house distilled spirit, but it might be a blend of their house mash bill at 4 years from warehouse A and, on this very specific floor with another warehouse. And so blending is done and there's a lot of science behind it. But yes, if you run out of business, a bank is going to take over and auction your spirit off to the highest bidder. And that spirit can end up just rebranded. There are, the TTB, Brandon kind of talked about this, that they are a little bit more strict with spirits. So the state of distillation, especially for something like whiskey, has to be declared. If you didn't actually distill it, you can't put that on the label. It'll be bottled by or blended by. So there are requirements, but there's no requirement to disclose who you got it from, or where you bought it from. And sometimes with brokers, you don't even know necessarily who the origin is. But yeah, it's a really interesting concept. When you get into the whiskey side of it, blending is a lot of fun. Everyone's unique. You have the exact same distillery, same still, same setup. Put it 300 miles away and you're going to make a different spirit, different operators. They're going to run it a different way. So those little variations, especially on the maturation side, are going to create huge changes in aroma and flavor profile.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how many people don't even realize how many of their favorite spirits are either bought in, how much pure bourbon originates in Indiana, for example.
Yeah.
And then how many of the most famous bourbon brands today were actually started in the 90s buying up excess inventory. And there's a real skill level to being able to create something that's more than the whole of its parts. And to your point, the hand behind it still has an enormous amount of artistry. But a lot of getting to that final quality product is having a much farther time horizon, a much farther view, Kyle. Can you speak a little to how you ensure today that some of those aged spirits are not going to turn out being absolute mouthwash by the time that's ready to come out of the barrel?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest stressor on the back of every distiller's mind that's producing aged spirits. At the end of the day, it's really just establishing metrics up front, KPIs that you can hit, that are measurable, and then that you can work towards on improving. The industry is not new. We're not reinventing bourbon production, and so we're able to kind of pull from a long line of tradition and history, but also innovation. The bourbon we make today and the industry makes today is very different than what was being made pre-prohibition, and it's just collectively gotten better. So strict adherence to hitting your target metrics. I think sometimes people look at distilling as like, oh, you can just take beer, you distill it, and you put it in a barrel, and that's it. And that's not always true. We have washes that sometimes exceed our tolerances, and we'll make the call as a wash whether or not we're going to introduce that to the still. Um, because it is right one system, and the introduction of harsh compounds that we're going to have trouble pulling out through that distillation could affect follow-on batches. And then it also comes, are you going to invest the time, the labor, the cost of the barrel? Barrels aren't cheap. Are you going to invest in that barrel to distill a product that you already know is unsatisfactory in the hopes that it turns out better? So you got to have, I got to, I'd say like, the conviction to pull the trigger and say, nope, this isn't worth it. And then do better the next time.
Absolutely. And obviously, with such an old category as something like bourbon, as something like traditional whiskeys, a lot's been vetted, a lot of process has been really well established. It's easy to forget that these industries, even though there's a craft side to them, do have a little more of a traditional bent in a lot of ways than what a lot of craft brewers do, at least in the U.S. But Brandon, working with hundreds of distilleries across the country, you have the opportunity, kind of a unique viewpoint to see some of the changes and some of the trends as they're happening even before they hit the market. Can you speak a little to some of the things that your customers and your clients might be doing a little differently, whether from a process standpoint, ingredient standpoint, or even just a product mix standpoint?
That's a great question.
Welcome to the webinar.
Yeah, great. It's interesting. It's one of the things, and this is going way back, like one of the things that I've noticed again, I've been here for a long time. But I started with the company in 2017. So I had a few years to kind of see, what craft distilleries were doing in the country prior to like a fairly large event that happened worldwide in 2020 that just like totally destroyed a lot of businesses, right?
What do you mean? Tell us more.
The pandemic, of course. So obviously the pandemic was quite difficult for a lot of businesses. There are lots of loans that went out, lots of closures, et cetera. Don't need to rehash that whole thing. But what I've seen is kind of on the heels of that is a lot of distilleries are getting more business savvy, especially in how they are creating their products. It's not just let's throw stuff at a wall and see what sticks anymore. It is being a little bit more thoughtful in what it is they're making, how they're going to market it, and sometimes how you market it is the story, and that story can even drive some of your process a little bit, right? So it's are you using new technologies for rapid aging that isn't the same as a 5 gallon barrel or something like that? Is that your shtick? And I've seen a few companies doing that. I've seen folks that are going the more traditional route, and it's that all comes ends up being part of your storytelling as a company. And again, that's driving process and it's driving your ingredients, what your products are at the end of the day. I've seen folks getting into, some more, not super well-known spirit types. I've seen the grappa that, you don't often see on the shelves. Lots of eau de vies, or not lots, but seeing eau de vies, seeing, akavit and things like that. But it's, everyone's got kind of has their core of like, here are our couple of core aged spirits, our couple of core, clear spirits. And then those are sort of the flagships and the driving force. And then you can kind of see the creativity on the outskirts of that. So it's a lot of that. And, obviously really getting into that RTD game, just making those crowd pleasers. It's a big thing that everyone's getting into. And, there's usually going to be some sort of twist based off of where you are in the United States. And, if you're in the Jersey Shore, the ingredients and story you're telling there versus being on the West Coast and things like that.
And if you feel like making a Hail Mary, look into gin. You can get so creative with gin, and it's a quick turnaround. The margins are good. You're going to be a lot better off doing that than taking a real big risk on some sort of aged spirit with some wild ingredients. I have had a single malt whiskey aged on Amberana wood. It was a wonderful, wonderful idea, and I will leave it at that. But there is a ton of opportunity to still be able to have that level of creativity, that level of playing in your playground that you would have with something like beer. That's a relatively short production cycle, relatively affordable production cycle, but in a way that's still being respectful, Brendan, to your point, that this is a business first, and it doesn't matter how good your spirit is. If you have to shut your doors, no one's going to get the chance to enjoy it. But how do you balance that mix of innovation versus consistency when it comes to spirits, Kyle?
Yeah, it's definitely tough. You want to we're constantly full of big kind of new ideas like, hey, what can we drive? We want a gin for every season of the year, right? So we can release to customers. That requires a ton of R&D, to get that right. At the end of the day, I think you need to we've hit on this. You need to figure out what you need to do to make a sustainable business. So you're not shutting your doors, and then from there you can kind of see what your pathways and how much time and labor you have available. What's establish an R&D budget? What does that actually look like? And then balance your passion with what the market is going to be interested in, and that's really challenging sometimes. There's plenty of like funky little things with whiskey I would love to do, but at the end of the day, if you ask me, hey, do you think someone on the customer facing side is going to buy this? I'm like, probably not. You put that on the label, they're probably going to walk away from it and be like, I don't want to try that. So it's a bit limiting, right? You have to get to sit them down for a tasting, but it's always just a balance. Figure out what you can do first, do it right, make sure that system is sustainable, and then from there start branching out and having fun.
Absolutely. Speaking of branching out and having fun, Brandon, are you seeing more of your customers starting to go the opposite way, starting to go from distilling into beer? One of the advantages of beer being that it has a lot of the same equipment with fewer direct investments out, as well as the fact that similar to clear spirits, you can commercialize it quickly. It gives you some of that freedom to be able to reinvest into the spirit side.
Yeah. Also a great question. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but that's not saying that there aren't. Usually people that are like we've had a few that have, had a plan of like this is what we're going to do. This is our vision. We're still early on, and maybe they're starting with the spirit side first so that they can get some barrels racked up while they're kind of getting other things in place. Usually you need a lot of investment capital there to do that. But I haven't seen too much of going the other way. But again, that's anecdotal.
Yeah.
So take that with a grain of salt.
Well, I guess that raises the question, Kyle, why do you think so many breweries are starting to look towards distilling? And do you see that trend continuing into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a market analysis guy, but we're currently seeing the same thing in the distilling industry that I think started a few years back with the brewing industry, right? The craft scene blew up. It's now leveling off. And so now there's this kind of, again, you have a lot of the same equipment, and with a little bit of capital investment, you can break into a whole new industry. At the end of the day, the biology, chemistry, the engineering, the physics, it's all the same principles. It's just a slightly different application. So I think it's a natural progression. At the end of the day, brewers just have to decide, or breweries just have to decide, do we want to add another tank farm to the cellar, or do we want to invest that or take that money, that investment, and put it into a still house and an on grain mash cooler, and now we can start making whiskey. We can make vodka. So it's not too big of a leap. I think it's as you grow, there's just two paths in front of you, and choose which one you're more interested in.
Two paths diverged.
Yeah.
Well, the same could even be said for the spirits industry writ large. It's no secret to anybody who's been following the news that there's a bit of a whiskey glut right now. Something
Yeah.
unfortunate to people like myself who really do prefer whiskey to most other spirits. But What are some of the directions that you see the spirits market more broadly heading in? Are there any trends on the horizon or any things that you've started to notice transforming in just the way that the market itself is adapting to the spirits industry and some of the signals that you're receiving?
Yeah, 5 years ago, bourbon and whiskey itself was what was exploding at the time, and right now that's agave spirit and tequila. So obviously, tequila is a protected class. We can't produce it in the United States, but we can produce agave spirit. So that's something that I think a lot of distilleries are looking into and trying to figure out how to make that work. I know we are as well, and then RTD cocktails. RTDs are just it's an amazing opportunity for experimentation, flavor profiles. There's absolutely like a regionality behind it. With Trillium, we have a Cape Codder, um, but those are drinks that they are, I think, from a brewing perspective, relatively easy to produce. From a distilling background, I don't want to say they're difficult or they make my life challenging. But there's still a lot of value to them. And so, we go after them pretty aggressively. We launched our RTD line about 2 months ago, and it's been great so far. And at the end of the day, I think RTDs are probably going to continue to lead the way. Just as the market shifts, you're able to offer lower alcohol content, a more diverse range of flavors, and you really do kind of cross that bridge between people who very firmly only like beer or they want a seltzer, and then someone that wants spirits. It's like, okay, here, try this seltzer made with vodka. Um, it's a great opportunity. You want a cocktail at home instead of a glass of whiskey or a beer. Cool. Here's our margarita. So I think RTDs and agave are probably the two hot topics right now. Whiskey, I think, will always have a big base to it, but it is getting, as you said, it's a saturated market. The larger producers are increasing the age of some of like their very core standard products, and so that's challenging to compete with from a craft perspective.
Absolutely. And I love the way that you approach RTDs, not from a point of frustration, but they can be frustrating to make, but they do provide opportunity for creativity. These are still handcrafted products, and that's something that a lot of times the both the beer industry and the craft spirits industry can lose sight of, is that just because our own tastes don't necessarily align with those of our customers, you can make great beer and stay a home brewer. You get into the beer industry to sell great beer, and that means needing to be responsive to a market, being responsive to your customers, and still approaching those things that might not be your preference with that same level of attentiveness, that same level of care, and that same level of passion that you would something that is a little closer to your own heart. But approaching things from a business standpoint, Brandon, can you speak a little to some of the real ways that distilleries can find efficiencies to offset some of those initial high costs that can go into getting a distilling program going? Some of the key ways, whether it's through tools or just through process, that distilleries can find a few extra dollars and make this something that's a little more viable and not such a cash sink, since beer's cash cycle is already pretty inverted from the get-go.
Yeah. Honestly, from my experience and just kind of working with all of our clients over the years, um, if you're just getting into it, I think starting small and starting with discipline is a very good way to kind of keep things, very focused from the start, and then you scale from there. And figuring out how you scale is always important. It can be very uh, exciting, and you might want to go ahead and just like do all of the different spirits that you possibly can and all the different RTDs and just kind of have a bunch of stuff to throw in the market. But you have to pay attention to your quality and your consistency, especially if you're a brewery moving to a distillery. It's you've established a reputation as a brewery. You need to match that as that distillery, right? So that's very critical. One of the things that I've seen over the years, the people that are starting off that are end up being very successful are those that have done, careful planning before they've even gotten software, before they've purchased a single piece of equipment. And it's, working with an experienced industry consultant is incredibly powerful. It's why, businesses such as ours have, partnerships with these consultants because we understand the value that that can bring. And it's, here's what you need to do. Here are the common mistakes that you can avoid. Here's how you can make your dollar go a little bit further in the beginning to make sure that you're, getting that return. Because if you're not getting that return on that investment, it's really hard to scale that business, and you do have to pay attention to everything.
No, completely. And Kyle, obviously coming at this from somebody who's been doing this your entire life effectively, you were probably born in a barrel. Can you speak a little in your own experience, some of those just key considerations for making this a profitable venture and squeezing a little more out of the investment that you might be making, especially when your reputation in a lot of ways is on the line. Brent, I appreciate you calling out the fact that if you build your reputation as a brewery and you feel your way through distilling out of the gate, that can actually have a negative impact on your business and your brand perception.
Yeah, that's it's definitely something that you need to take into account. I think probably from a distilling perspective, when we look at consistency, one of the things that we're most concerned with is that batch over batch. And brewers are going to kind of adhere to that the same way. Um, but when you turn the still on for the first time, you definitely want to be have the discipline to say, hey, this first distillation didn't actually make the cut, and don't push that spirit forward. You can always redistill product. You can take the neutral, you can blend it out, but be very careful about how you launch that spirits program and how you put product forward. It's just like a brew deck. The first time you turn it on, you have to commission it. It's not just the recipe. You're just adding another layer in that commissioning where, okay, now we're going to commission, the recipe on the brew house side. Now it gets to the distillery. You need to commission it there on the still, and have I guess the courage to say, hey, this doesn't meet our standard, and we don't want to risk not just a new brand under the distillery, but you don't want to risk the brewery's brand either.
No, completely. And, preserving your brand, preserving that trust is key. You're not a real distillery until you've dumped some spirit. You're not a real brewery until you've dumped some beer. That's part of that commitment to quality that has to be at the core of what sets a craft distillery or craft brewery or craft winery or craft cidery apart from somebody who's making it on an industrial scale is, our variability at this scale is higher. And part of that means that our highs are higher, but also our lows are lower. And that's something we need to be mindful of and be responsive to. But Don in the chat actually asked a question regarding some of the licensing concerns, whether at the local or state level, that you can run into with having distillery and a brewery in the same place, and obviously you have the tasting room or cocktail bar in the mix as well. So, have either of you had any experience or run into any issues when it comes to the regulatory side, the licensing side, and how these can interplay with each other?
I'll let Brandon go from there.
You're gonna do that. As someone who works with a software company, we always defer to, it's a good idea, especially as you're getting into distilled spirits, because like again, it's not only federal. Like we primarily think about and focus a lot on the federal regulations, but you've got state, you've got the local, and they all have their own regulations, right? It's a complicated web of things to step through as you're trying to also start a business. And going back to what I said before, investing in getting a consultant, someone who's experienced, someone who can help navigate that is always important And if nothing else, they can help build your network. And I think both brewing and distilling are, sort of communal based businesses. You build that network, you call up your friend, and it's like, hey, like I'm starting this thing. What has been your experience? And that can always be helpful, which is a total cop out answer. I
Well, and I do think the nature of answering this question, Don, I do appreciate dropping that in there, is the challenge with the sheer complexity of the regulatory structure in the US for spirits, even more so than most ferments. I make the running joke that we're dealing with 50 individual countries worth of alcohol regulations here in the US. It's not inaccurate. And with spirits, it can get complicated even down to the municipal level. So definitely make sure that you're contacting a legal consultant or an attorney who's able to actually provide you with the regulations. What you need to do is stay within them. But some of the ones that you might run into, depending on the requirements for bonded space versus unbonded space, you might have storage challenges, and you might not actually be able to sell your own product to your own tasting room without passing through a wholesaler, even if that's allowed by law for your brewed product. That's a pretty key consideration. There's some jurisdictions as well, Texas is one, have certain requirements over what you are allowed to do from a wholesale and self distro perspective for your beer on the basis of whether or not you have the ability to serve spirits in your tasting room as well. So in some jurisdictions, you can only serve both spirits and beer in your own tasting room if you have the equivalent of like a brew pub license. So that can actually lead you to limitations on your ability to distribute beyond your four walls, and could actually have pretty severe implications for whether or not you're A, able to serve your own spirits on premise, or B, whether or not you're able to continue with your wholesale business. So the best advice I have is definitely refer and defer to local legal authorities, but it is something you have to make sure that you have a good understanding and grasp of ahead of time, because it could have pretty severe knock-on impacts on the rest of your business if you don't have a full understanding. And at the end of the day, if there's one thing that we can drive home here, is that you should only be moving from brewing into distilling if it's something that adds to your business, not something that is a distraction, not something that's just a passing fancy or even a deep passionate interest. It needs to be incrementally additive to what you're already doing with your core business, which is in the brewing side. But on that note, if you do have any other questions, go ahead and drop them into the chat. But Kyle, Brandon, appreciate you being on here. I got one more question for each of you. Now, Kyle, I'll start with you. If you have one piece of advice for breweries looking to get into the distilling space, what would it be? No pressure.
Yeah. I'm gonna steal this from Brandon. He's already said it, but I wholeheartedly agree with it. Defer, as you said, defer and refer, but to consultants, whether that's compliance, their lawyers, or project engineers and chemical engineers. If they're available, use them. They're gonna, it might be a big cost up front, but I guarantee they're going to save you from having to do rework down the line. That is, you're going to have a system set up, and then you're going to have to shut down production on both. Depending on where it is, you could interrupt production in both the distillery and the brewery. Use your consultants. Use any source of knowledge and experience that you have available to you. And capitalize on it, right? Most of us have learned these kind of issues and these accidents through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. If you can prevent that yourself, listen to the people who've been there.
As somebody who has been a consultant full time for 6 years and still does a decent amount of consulting on the side, I can tell you it is only cheaper to go without a consultant if the time that you are wasting on trial and error and damaged brand perception and dumped batches is cheaper than what you'd be paying the consultant. So I will certainly echo that. But Brandon, how about on your end?
Yeah, it's in the same vein. It's using your network, but I would say the double whammy of starting a distillery, it's getting that assistance to build that business plan that includes what's the equipment, what are the recipes, there are some consultants out there that can help, with your recipes and your formulas. And oh, by the way, did you know that you need to submit your formulas to the TTD for approval? Which is to say, like the at least U.S. federal regulation, it's as it pertains to distilled spirits, it can be a minefield. There can be some gotchas in there. The laws have been modernized over the years, but having someone who knows it in and out is a really powerful thing before you touch software. If you can get all of those pieces into place and then you get software, you are set up for success. Again, underestimating the complexity of those laws can be a major downfall. And the last thing you want to do is run a distillery for a couple of years, find yourself in an audit and have one of those oh shit moments. So
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for everybody who tuned in or who is watching after the fact. We really appreciate y'all. And that's another webinar in the books. So make sure you check back in with us next month, where we're actually going to be meeting with Andrew Copeland of Craft Beer Professionals, talking about trends in the beer industry, as well as wanting to hear from you. What sort of things do you want to hear about? What sort of topics interest y'all? We want to be responsive and be able to deliver information you can use, whether or not you're a Beer 30 customer. That's a lot less relevant, because at the end of the day, we are all in this together. Cheers, everybody, and have a great one.
everyone.